Well, hello and welcome to the Big Three, where we focus on one topic from the world of cybersecurity. And I'll be asking three key questions. And with me to provide expert insight are two colleagues who have a wealth of experience between them, and all of this in just 30 minutes. So thank you very much for joining us today in this live webinar and simultaneous podcast that will be available after the broadcast through your usual podcast provider. I'm Ade Clewlow, and with me today is Paul Vlasidis, Technical Director and Senior Advisor, waving at you there for those of you watching at NCC Group. Paul engages with boards and senior leadership teams in particular to advise on holistic approaches to cyber resilience. Also with me is Lawrence Monroe, there, our Director of Innovation. Lawrence works across the business to drive our strategy and to enhance the value that we add to our broad client base. So the topic today is how to make your cyber resilience budget work smarter. So considering the extraordinary change we have all experienced in the last 3 months or so, the huge hit to our economy and the impending recession, budgets for cybersecurity are going to be under increasing levels of pressure. But how much pressure and what will be the best way to address this? Well, that's the subject of today's discussion. So we hope to navigate these three questions in a way that unpacks these challenges a little bit more clearly. We're also going to be running a kind of a live Q&A throughout the broadcast for webinar viewers. So if you have any comments or questions, please just write them into the question area of the webcast of the webinar, and we'll pick them up as we go, and maybe have a couple of questions at the end if we have time. So let's open up and let's have the first question. So a recession is looming. We had the Chancellor's statement yesterday confirming everything we needed to know about the state of our economy. CISOs are going to have to get used to doing more with less, and those outside the regulated sectors in particular are going to feel the pinch. So how can CISOs and IT professionals prioritize their investment in this very challenging economic environment without putting their networks at risk? Paul, I'm going to turn to you first for your thoughts, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Thanks, Ade. Yeah, I think it's true that because I've already started to see it from some of the contacts I have, that security budgets are quite high on the list of things that get looked at in light of the sort of the squeeze on spending, I totally understand that and totally get it. So I think, CISOs are all going to have to get used to doing sort of the same or more with less. So it is all about trying to get the most out of the reduced budget that you're going to get, and that's kind of frustrating because to some extent, I think arguments that were sort of hard fought and won have been essentially everyone's been rolled back to square one again because of the situation that we're in, and I understand that. And in a way, it's the worst sort of time because there's been some research done recently by Portsmouth University, which demonstrates that actually fraud rises during recession. So actually the threat landscape is getting worse. So in a way, there isn't really a worse time to be in this situation. And in terms of that sort of insider threat, but in terms of external threat, again, organized crime groups are going to find life easier in terms of recruiting new members, and also they're going to find things like ransomware, which is already probably the #1 threat for a lot of organizations, is going to be seen as even more lucrative than it currently is. So no question that budgets are going to be under threat. I think in terms of what you can do about it, which ultimately is why we're here, I think for many of us in the last sort of 3 months, some of us were on a journey to digital transformation. We'd already done some work in that space, and some people have had to accelerate that and have moved fast into, Office 365 and various other kind of cloud related activities. So I think, so capitalizing on that, going back and rethinking, how you can get the most out of that, because the security benefits of moving to cloud are well documented. I'm not going to sort of dwell on them here. And therefore there may be some real opportunities there to go back and rethink the budget around that. But what I would say is that, just to sort of close my opening sort of salvo, is where it comes to things like basic security hygiene, stuff like credential management, multi-factor authentication, patching, those things, I think that they have to be protected. If you're going to protect any form of the budget, I really think that has to be the number one area that you protect. And then I would say on my list, second on my list would be sort of detection and response capability for actually instrumenting the network, particularly if you've got a lot of technical debt, security debt within the network, where it's really difficult sometimes to put in place some of these best practice security sort of technologies. So having the ability to detect and respond to those, I think, is probably the second on my list.
That's good, Lawrence. Your take on it. You're coming at it obviously from a very slightly different perspective. But are there any sort of real big handfuls of ideas that you have around this question of prioritization?
Just to really echo Paul's points, really. So I think it's looking for the opportunity in the crisis, right? Don't let a good crisis go to waste. I think where there's been historically lots of distractions for CISOs in particular, from lots of vendors and lots of people kind of, what's the latest tech, what's the latest thing that I need to be thinking about, APTs, etc. But I think the opportunity is really to think about fundamentals and think about the basics, because when you look at things like red teams or more technical assessments, quite often you find that it's always the basics where people are failing, or kind of they're trying to run before they can walk. So really, let's take this chance to, where we have more pressure on that, is really get the fundamentals right and really focus on those things. So try and look at it from a perspective of having a simplified worldview, or at least a simplified view of your attack surface. I think there's also an opportunity here to demand more value from your suppliers, so and more from your vendors. So where you have those kind of strategic relationships already, or where you're looking to develop them, lean on your partners more, lean on the trusted advisors that you have, and try and get more value from them. They're going to be doing a lot of work at this time, and it's probably feeling the pinch from clients wanting to, price pressure, all those kinds of things. So definitely look to lean on providers and third parties that you would typically trust.
Yeah, so a lot of people talk about when times are as they are now. You need to really focus in on absolutely essentials, and whilst you always want to have an eye on where you're going, and clearly you still want to have a sense of direction with your strategy, but if you at a time where there is such limited resource, or potentially limited resource, you need to focus in, don't you? And you touched on it, Paul, in terms of focusing on some of the basics. So do you still throw out some of those great ideas that you have, because there is still going to be the upfront cost now, because it will save you money later? Or how do you deal with that challenge of knowing something is going to cost money? And we'll come on to this in a little bit in terms of then how to present that. But when you know that you need to do something because you know it's going to save money later downstream, how can you deal with that in such a sort of tight fiscal environment?
So I think some of that is going to be down to the relationship that you have with the CFO, the board, etc., in terms of your track record, and so have you got a record of delivering for the business? They're going to be more likely to believe you and to accept your business case if you have. But I think there's actually lots of opportunity to get a sort of good evidence base together around this stuff now. So this basic hygiene stuff, actually Lawrence touched on red teaming there. I mean, if you're still at the stage where you have to convince the stakeholders, the senior stakeholders in the business, that you that you have a problem and that you need to spend money on security, then things like red teaming are a great way to do that, even if it's a limited scope, because you can actually show, and if you can get things like, you can see things like attack paths are being produced as part of the report, so you can actually see the stepwise way in which somebody is able to come into your network, or an insider is able to get at the critical data. You can make a very strong case. I mean, boards react very well to those types. I say well, but they certainly do pay attention to those types of activity, and you can use that as a solid evidence base on which to say, right, this is why we need to do the following. But you really do need to have your ducks in a row. I think the idea that you can just kind of, and not that I suspect many people do this anymore, but the idea that you can just say, right, well, here's a number, and we just need to sort of go out and buy a load of tools, and and they will all be silver bullets in their own way, and they will fix a lot of our problems. I mean, those days are, I think, over. The vendors would have you believe otherwise, but actually, I think buying the latest sort of AI thing that's going to do something using machine learning to solve all your security problems is not, focusing on the basics is what it's about. And you can demonstrate that that it is those basics that need focusing on through things like red teaming and focused kind of testing to show that, credential management, patching, all the basics still have to be, addressed. And if you haven't done that, then, now's the time to just focus in on that, and all the other stuff can just be left until later.
So one of the questions that has just jumped in, and I think it's topical and worthy of mentioning it, and the name is, I think it's been sent privately. The focus on essentials is great, but there's a lot of research out there that suggests that getting the basics right is still a struggle for many organizations, and the lack of budget now is a good catalyst to refocus efforts on the lowest hanging fruit. And that's a good phrase, actually, because essentially that's really what, in a sense, what we're talking about. It's what can we do now that organizations are going to feel competent enough to be able to address, that is not going to make that big impact, that big resource impact on the budget. Lawrence, maybe a couple of minutes from you before we move on to the second question, just to look at that low-hanging fruit question. And thank you.
I totally agree with that,
Lawrence.
Sorry, thanks, Ade. Yeah, I totally agree with that statement. It is something that still eludes a lot of organisations getting those basics correct. Things like asset management are really difficult challenges, and there is no silver bullet. It takes lots of time. I would say one thing I would say is take this opportunity to take stock and reflect on how you achieve those and how your spending plan was looking across the year previously. In business, there's a concept of sunk cost fallacy, which is a kind of human bias to, that links with loss aversion bias and other kind of things, which is essentially, if you spent X amount of money, then you are predisposed to keeping on spending at whatever cost to achieve the end goal. So I would say be aware of that. There are things that you should stop and take stock and look at investing money from other, perhaps mid-flow transformation projects. How can you close off those avenues gracefully and then reinvest in those areas, such as getting the basics correct with asset management, looking at kind of point solutions. There's a lot of interesting new innovative vendors in the point solution place. It's not all going to be silver bullets, but there's some really interesting things and some interesting open source that provides valid input for businesses. So I would suggest, I know lots of CISOs who've had big successes with open source. Obviously, you need to understand the risks and the risk versus benefits, etc. But it is worth considering what you can do and how you can kind of carry things over. But don't be scared to, can something that's going to be a longer term thing, which maybe, won't have the kind of impact and bang. Also looking at like your anything that's been stood up during the crisis, such as remote infrastructure settings. It's time to step back and review and look at those things and see how well you did in the heat of the moment, and kind of not be scared to look and address those kinds of things right now as well.
Okay, that's great.
And also, just to add to that, if you've got if you've got a program of testing sort of laid out, given that our ways of working have shifted significantly, you probably need to revisit that now and say, well, okay, we need to test in the light of the changes that we've all gone through in the last sort of 3 months. So some of those ideas that you probably had about kinds of testing that you were going to do, the kinds of assurance that you were going to put in place, we may well need to revisit that now. And actually picking up on Lawrence's point, which I think is really good about open source, is actually a really excellent point. There are things you can do. So let's say you're at the very early stages, or you have no significant sort of endpoint detection or SIEM type program in place as a business yet. It was on your to-do list and you haven't got there yet. You know, there are open source solutions out there, such as things like Logging Made Easy from the NCSC, which is a completely open source solution. It's probably not for a larger organization going to solve all of your problems, but what it can do is it can provide you at a very low cost of entry, almost zero, because you still got to put time in, but it can actually start to help you build that evidence base on which you can say, look, we can see some real value from this type of technology, instrumenting our network, understanding what our security events are, those kind of things. Now it makes sense to justify that additional spend to go into maybe a full managed detection and response type capability. So there are definitely things you can do.
So that's a really good lead in to our second question, which we'll move to seamlessly now, and it's on the back of what you were just saying there, Paul. With the shock to our ways of working being so big of recent times, and the rapid adoption of technology to enable home working at such scale, whether it's, I don't like this phrase, the new normal, but whatever the case, there are new attack surfaces opening up, and there are new challenges that 6 months ago CISOs and senior leaders wouldn't have had to have looked at. So what approach should CISOs, senior leaders in business and organizations take in terms of their next steps to secure their assets going forward? And so this is less about about the budget restrictions. It's more about what are the sensible decisions that should be made to address that. Paul, I sort of half interrupted you. So.
Yeah, I mean, so you didn't really. I mean, I think I've made the point, which is that you know, people are working in a new way. Quite often, large portions of our workforce, whole teams, are now working from home. Processes that used to happen in the office now happen remotely, and actually some things may well have been relaxed from a security point of view in order to allow that to happen. I was talking to a CISO this morning who said that they'd had an old Skype for Business server that had actually been shown to be quite vulnerable because you could enumerate, it was an old link server basically, you could enumerate staff through that, and that had been shown up in a red team environment, red team test as being a vulnerability that allowed the red team to actually get a foothold. But he said, actually, we've had to keep it going because it was the only way we could effectively run our call centers remotely, so we actually had to sort of effectively redeploy it in that way. But he said, obviously it's on my list of things to get rid of in the near future because they're moving across to a full Teams environment. But that's just one example where people have sort of knowingly sort of left things from a security point of view, perhaps not as you would like it, in order for the expediency of being able to actually get your sort of workforce working remotely. But I do think that needs to be that does need to be A, known about, and B, sort of kept on a to-do list so that you actually have a strategy or some tactical approaches to actually handling that going forwards.
And Lawrence, you recently wrote a short blog on the subject of coming out of the home working environment, sort of post, I can't really call it post-COVID, but post serious lockdown COVID, and you highlighted one or two interesting points on that as well, I think.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, just to echo Paul's points, yes, it is time to take stock and look at any kind of hastily made decisions, gaps in policies, or changes in policies that have been made on the fly that have not been documented. I think there's going to be a lot of kind of quickly made decisions that people have forgotten about, and infrastructure that stood up. So now's a good time to look at that and kind of reevaluate that. I think on the remote working situation as well, I think as people are starting to adopt you know, kind of have this hybrid model of working remote, going into office, I think, you know, it increases the risks of shadow IT. And I think shadow IT has probably been more of a thing during the COVID-19 kind of period than usual, because people are battling systems that aren't designed for concurrency, capacity, authorization for things they need to access, internet access from home, 4G, all this kind of things. So I think it's kind of pushed towards that as well. So it's worth kind of looking at those things. I definitely say it's not. In terms of understanding the risk profile of these changes and the way that they've gone, it's definitely worth doing assessments rather than kind of just guessing and saying, oh, well, I stood this thing up, it's probably okay, I've just patched it, things like that. So I think definitely doing assessments is kind of a wise spend at the moment in terms of getting a snapshot of what your security looks like now, because it may well be different from what it was before, and your plans changing potentially as well, how that's going to impact that and what the threat models now look like.
So so that again, we're now at a good point to sort of wrap this up with a third question. And just incidentally, thank you very much for everybody who's asking questions. I'm grabbing a couple if we've got time at the end. We've got a good question here, which we need to limit to, just 5 minutes or so. But CISOs in particular, you generally have the most in-depth understanding of the implications of not doing something to secure your estate, and you can look at people, processes, and technology to the nth degree. But the bottom line is, within a business and an organization, how do you make yourself heard? So first Paul, then Lawrence, and then we'll go to a question from one of the viewers.
Okay, so partly it comes back to something I said earlier on. I think you need a solid evidence base. I think there is, if you may have some evidence from your own networks, from previous tests that have been done, that you can build that evidence base to say this is why we need to do this now. It might be a security hygiene type project, or it may be something else. So first of all, get the evidence base right. Secondly, I mean, your biggest allies, if you're talking about convincing the board, your biggest allies are your non-exec directors. So your non-exec directors are typically not technically minded people, so they're not going to respond well to a sort of jargon heavy kind of paper, but they will be there making sure, or asking the right questions about, and actually there's some great papers been produced around this stuff. The NCSC has an excellent pack on for non-exec directors, and actually Ollie Whitehouse did a great paper a couple of years ago on this as well, questions that they should be asking. But they're your biggest ally, and so going out of your way to make sure they're correctly informed as to the threats and the risks as you see them as a CISO, I think will massively help your case in the boardroom. But I think we all have to accept that we're all going to have to, the budget's going to be a lot smaller than it used to be. It may be that it's a manpower budget that's reduced. It may be that it's a tooling budget that it's reduced. It may be both. And so you may have to look at more creative ways in which to achieve some of those ends. And it may be that in some cases, you buy in a service rather than trying to build your own SOC, for example, which can obviously have a very high upfront cost and might be difficult for a board to swallow, but it might be that you can get a service up and running quite quickly. So there's lots of things like that, but ultimately it needs to come back to having that solid evidence base, I think.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, Lawrence, just maybe a final word from you on that question.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree with Paul. I think it's about building that evidence. If you don't have good threat intelligence and things like that, it's looking to partners who can provide that. Kind of looping back on a couple of my points previously, which is leaning on your partners and third parties and trusted advisors and open source. Things like MISP, for example, is a great project which kind of helps you aggregate IOCs and threat intelligence kind of centrally in one place. So something like that will really help feed the case. If you can talk about the threat landscape with specificity to your industry as well, that's obviously going to resonate within the organization. So just kind of looping those things back and joining them together, I think TI and combined with actual assessments are going to put you in a really strong position to make a compelling case to get that investment.
Good. Okay. Well, that's excellent. So questions are coming in thick and fast, actually, and there's been a very interesting question. I'm afraid I haven't grabbed the name of who asked it, but just with a couple of minutes to go. So the question is, if the number of in-house security staff is being reduced and responsibilities for security are outsourced to external providers, is that a long-term cost-effective way of managing cyber resilience for an organization? So start with you, Paul.
Well, the answer is sort of classic consultant's response. It's going to be, it depends. So I think what I have seen, let me say what I have seen. So I have seen organizations attempting to do stuff in-house where it was not a core sort of function of the organization. Security rarely is, to be fair. So I'm talking non-regulated organizations here, because, you know, slightly different world if you're regulated. And it really didn't make any sense from a sort of because you know, they weren't really able to pay the kind of the wages. They were getting very high levels of staff turnover because there's such a demand for the skills, and actually it would have made a lot more sense for them to have just gone to a third party and actually procured a service. And taking Lawrence's point, you know, and then leaning on that provider to make sure that service was exactly what they needed it to be and actually was fit for purpose, and making sure that, you know, that they got the most out of that relationship. And then a lot of those problems about, you know, how you're resourcing in terms of sort of skills, etc., just go away, because now it might look like it's more of a sort of an upfront cost, but actually I think probably in the sort of medium to long term for a lot of organizations it makes a lot of sense. As I say, in the regulated world, it may make a lot more sense to keep your own. So
yeah, okay. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll just take that answer on that particular question, and Lawrence, I've got one for you. And I'll see if I can grab the name of the person who asked it. One way that we can help prioritize implementation of strategic security elements can be the articulation of its value to the business. Very pertinent to our third question. Can you outline how you quantify the potential future impact of the various aspects of security? You've got a lot of experience of this, Lawrence. How do you answer that in probably about a minute and a half?
I'll try my best. So in terms of quantification of risk and threat, it's kind of almost the holy grail across an organization to have or establish that kind of monetary, which is what I think is being asked in terms of that value. I think, yeah, it's always challenging to really quantify things. I think you could probably start by trying to create a universal language of how you try and talk about threat and risk is kind of where you want to start that kind of journey, and that kind of thinking is making sure that you can talk about things and you know, regardless of source, and how you can pull those things together. So I think that's really important in doing it. So I think that's kind of core to it, is making sure that you can talk and people talk universally about those kinds of things across the business. And then in terms of the articulation, I think it's just about making it understandable and making sure that non-technical people can understand what it is that you're trying to articulate and the value of different things across the organization.
So can I just throw something in here? So something I've seen work well. So I don't think whatever, it is a holy grail. I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where it says spend this on security and you will save this on risk. I don't think that I mean, maybe one day, but no one is really that mature yet to be able to do that. Very few people that I've ever come across. What I think you can do though is you can spend time, particularly with your board and with your non-exec directors, to exactly understand what your risk appetite is as a business and really define that in terms that mean something to that business. And then what you can say is, well, if we spend this amount of money, that will actually bring us within risk appetite in this time frame. And then you're really testing, and that's a different type of conversation, but I think you're demonstrating the value of the spend in different ways. It's like, if you spend this much now, you can do it in half the time. If you, or maybe, in other words, you're shifting the conversation a little bit, but you're actually, it's more achievable to talk about things like that than it is to talk about spend X, save Y in terms of risk. I think that's my own view.
It's exactly, and we all know that it's not a binary conversation either. So thank you to Stephen Jackett for that question at the end. So that's pretty much all we've got time for. Thank you very much to my guests, Paul and Lawrence, for their time and their insight. And also thank you for joining us in this broadcast. And if you're listening to the podcast, thank you very much for listening. So we will be back with another episode of The Big Three very soon. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.